call him or her a spy. They'll even call someone like Avril Haines, who is the new director of national intelligence, as the top spy in America. Well, Avril Haines wouldn't know what a spy is. Her background is in the law and is in administration or management. You may call me whatever you like, but I like to think of myself as a spy handler. That is, a case officer who worked with spies, recruited spies.
Dr. Waller, are you ready to start?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. If I break off, it's because Burton, I double as tech support for the program. So when people are struggling to get into the Zoom room, then I get a call at about this time. But I think it's okay now. So welcome everyone again to Town and Gown. It's lovely to see so many people, and I think this has broken our record for the number of attendees.
Thank you.
For those of you who are new, my name's John Waller. I'm the director of an academic program at Michigan State called the Social Science Scholars Program. And this initiative is in partnership with East Lansing Primetime. And it's nice to see Kelly Arndt here, who directs that really superb program, and also Age Alive in the School of Osteopathic Medicine. The moderator this evening is Chris Ike, and he's a member of the Scholars Program, but he also attends James Madison College. He studies international relations with a focus on European studies, and very appropriately, after graduation, he hopes to go into security studies. I did just want to, before Chris introduces our distinguished speaker, just to say how grateful I am to you, Burton, for making the time to Zoom into this session. When we started setting up the Scholars Program in 2014, right at the beginning, I was introduced to Burton, and on several occasions, he came up to Michigan State and spoke to the scholars, and they were always wonderful presentations. And he's also been a long-standing supporter of the Scholars Program, for which we're very grateful. So thank you, Burton. Welcome, everyone, and over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Dr. Waller. Just before I begin, can everyone hear me? I was having a little bit of connectivity issues. All right, perfect. So this Town and Gown session is, of course, as Dr. Waller mentioned, with Mr. Burton Gerber, who graduated from Michigan State University in 1955 and served in the Central Intelligence Agency for 39 years as a case officer and chief of station in 3 communist countries. In 2006, he received Michigan State University's Distinguished Alumnus Award, and with his late wife, Rosalie, has endowed scholarships at Michigan State. Mr. Gerber now teaches at the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University and has co-written 2 books on the ethics and the importance of espionage. First, Transforming U.S. Intelligence in 2005, and Vaults, Mirrors, and Masks in 2010. Mr. Gerber is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and is a Knight of Malta. His career in Moscow is described in detail in David Hoffman's best-selling book, The $1 Billion Spy, a true story of the Cold War espionage and betrayal. You can read more about Hoffman's book here, which we have in the link provided in the Town and Gown flyer, and hopefully the forthcoming movie, which I'm sure we are all awaiting, as well as Mr. Gerber. So welcome, Dr. Gerber, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Professor Waller, for both of you for having invited me to this program and to meet with the members of the Town and Gown group. It's an honor to have the opportunity to chat with you. Chris gave a very good summary of what's kept me occupied for the this year it's 65 years, 66 years since I graduated from Michigan State. But I've been back there from time to time through my links to James Madison College and the College of Social Science and the library of your university. In talking about intelligence, specifically espionage, I thought it easiest to use a real example, and this is the one that Chris just mentioned, the spy case that's included in the book $1 Billion Spy by David Hoffman, and the spy's name was Adolf Tolkachov. And this is such an interesting case that I think it illustrates many of the principles of espionage and what goes on in trying to do a case like this to gain information for the advantage of the United States over its adversaries. In this case, it was obviously the Soviet Union. I realize that a number of people are greatly interested in spy novels or spy movies. And I generally avoid them because I think that they are not at all reflective of the real story of espionage. I generally avoid spy movies as well. And most of the spy movies, of course, don't deal with espionage. They deal with blowing up things like the James Bond movies. There's nothing spy about a James Bond movie. Recently, just a week or so ago, I did watch, because I now have streaming services and I have way too much opportunity to watch movies if I like. I watched the movie Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which is based on a Le Carré novel. Now, my prejudice is very strongly against Le Carré. I realize that the media refer to him as having written very realistic novels. The ones I've read, I think, are not realistic from my own experience of 39 years. And in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which starred Gary Oldman, I was fascinated by the fact that I could not find a single incident in that movie which was realistic about the spy business. It's an author's and Hollywood producers' idea of the spy business. So I'd like to walk through the Tolkachov case as outlined in Hoffman's authoritative book, $1 Billion Spy, of what a real spy case is about and how it's handled. Because that was run by CIA in Moscow, the hardest place to run a spy operation, certainly in my day. And it ran successfully from 79 to 85 when the agent was arrested. So one issue that comes up about how do you get a spy? Do we recruit them? Yes. Do they come to us voluntarily? Yes. There's both of those instances. In a place like Moscow, we don't have the opportunity to recruit a spy going through the measures of identification of a target, of gathering information on the target, of meeting the target, of manipulating the target, and working through to a recruitment operation. We can't do that because the KGB is all over us. And nowadays, it's not called the KGB, it's called the Internal Services, called the FSB. They command that world. So we can't get to that kind of degree of intimacy with a target that would allow for recruitment. I have to recruit a spy, I have to know what that person needs. So I can then provide that that item, that concept that he needs. And the kinds of motivations I look for might be ideological, might be sense of resentment or revenge, a sense of adventure, a sense of feeling not appreciated, a need to help family, a need to get out of a sudden situation which is threatening. Any of those things are what I'm trying to determine when I'm outside of Moscow, when I'm outside of the Soviet Union, when I'm working in other areas, and when I'm trying to target. I have recruited spies in every country that I have served in, or responded, as in the Soviet Union, to volunteers. And that's what Tolkachev was. And the thing about volunteers is you never know, each day as you go about your business, you never know when one's going to appear, which means that you always have to be at the ready. And in the Tolkachev case, he approached the then chief of station, Bob Fulton, at the diplomatic gas station. Now in Moscow in those days, there were the number of total gas stations in the city was probably 10 or 12. This is not, Soviet Union was not a consumer focused society. But one of the gas stations was so-called diplomatic. The better word for it would be hard currency. In other words, you got your gas there with the coupons that as a foreigner you had to use rather than rubles. So any Soviet citizen would know that that's where diplomats went for gas, and their license plates would identify what country they were from, because the KGB wanted to keep close eye on us. And so he approached, Tolkachev approached Fulton, who was filling up his tank, and handed him some papers, an envelope with some papers, and disappeared. And Fulton pocketed them, didn't do anything out of the ordinary, because he can never be sure who's watching what. And eventually, back at the embassy, he could read what he had and realize that here was a man claiming to be a Soviet avionics engineer who was offering his services to the United States. This is big news. It's not unusual news. There are a number of Soviets each year who would approach us, or in today's world, it would be Russia. I use the word Soviets and think of, in today's world, it would be Russians, because it's not the Soviet Union anymore. And so he reported this immediately to headquarters. Now, a station is responsible to headquarters, much more so than many of you might expect, although we'll get into some of the differences that may result in that may develop during an operation. Headquarters was, Fulton was enthusiastic, and the volunteer had suggested a meeting, a next meeting within about a week at a certain location. And Fulton was prepared to do that, as would I have been if I had been the COS at the time. But headquarters did not like it. Headquarters was concerned, this was early 77. Headquarters was concerned that it could be a, quote, Soviet provocation, a word that I hated and tried to eliminate from the intelligence vocabulary. And they didn't want to be embarrassed, so they ordered that nothing be done with it, which caused Tolkachev several more times during the year to approach either Fulton or Fulton's successor, Gus Hathaway, again, offering to be working with us. And he identified himself enough as an avionics engineer that we could see exactly what he was working on. And it was Soviet air defense, which is really important for the United States Air Force and the United States Navy. The air defense programs are both the ones in the Soviet Union and then the tactics for airplanes, Soviet fighter aircraft. It took until 1979 for headquarters, late 78, because it happened on January 1st, 79, for headquarters to agree that the station could contact the volunteer, which was done by a phone call which directed him to a dead drop. And you've all heard about things like dead drops, where we might leave information, materials, equipment for an agent. And he went and retrieved it because we could observe that. And he responded to that with letters, which a complicated system of that, but we could ensure that they were safe letters for him to put secret writing in. And there was enough in his letters as he sent them to us for headquarters finally to agree with the station that now we do meet with this man, because this was not an agent that you could handle indirectly. You had to meet with him. And meetings in a place like Moscow under the purview of the KGB, FSB, are very difficult. You do them late at night. You do them under the cover of darkness. In the summer, that means you get very little darkness in Moscow in the winter, but around midnight you do. So we then began meeting this man. And we already knew something about motivation, which I had discussed before briefly with you. And his motivation was he wanted to bring down the Soviet Union. He was very much a Russian patriot, but not a Soviet Union patriot. As we later learned, the Soviet Union, he was married to his wife's mother had been liquidated in the Stalinist purges when she was only a girl. The Tolkachev's wife was only about 2. And her father was arrested and put into the camps and not released until Stalin died in '53. So the family had a strong anti-communist bias. But what do you do with that bias? Well, if you're what Tolkachev recognized, if he could write, he could be like Solzhenitsyn. But he couldn't write. I mean, he didn't see himself as that. He saw himself as a scientist. But he knew that where he was working, what he was doing, was very important work. And that by cooperating with the Americans, he could help America destroy the Soviet Union. And that's simply what his motivation was. And he had a plan, as he discussed with us in we always exchanged operational letters. And his plan was to work for a number of years, photographing documents, giving them to us, the photographs, the camera rolls, and hoping to bring down the Soviet Union that way. He talked to us about his sympathy for people like Solzhenitsyn and for those writers, intellectuals who were working in other ways, and he was figuring out his way to do it. So we began a very fruitful relationship with Tolkachev. Keep in mind that we're meeting him late at night, cover of darkness, dodging KGB surveillance, having to be experts in what KGB surveillance was, because you don't dare make a mistake. A mistake kills the agent. At a typical meeting, he'd give us 50, 60, 70, once over 100 rolls of film. So you had to be prepared to take those away and carry them away. Everything was done in Russian, so you had to be a good Russian speaker, understand the local system, understand Russians who are different than Americans. When you're dealing with an espionage agent, you're dealing with a complicated human being, and you have to have certain psychological skills. And that's what our case officers, of course, are trained to have. So at first, he was using a camera that we gave him, a Pentax, and he would photograph documents which he would obtain in his institute, take them home at lunchtime because he lived within walking distance, photograph them, return the documents, keep the camera rolls in a safe place in his apartment until he would meet with us. Later on, as systems changed at his institute, he could no longer work that system. So we gave him spy cameras, which were quite good for the purpose, but which are more difficult to use, particularly under not sufficient light. We also gave him a light meter because you have to know how to set it up for photography in the institute. He would do that often in the toilet area of the institute. He couldn't do it in his office, obviously, because offices are shared. But he kept up that operation for all those years. During that time, we, of course, were constantly dealing with him through operation. At each meeting, he would give us the film and he would give us a letter, usually explaining things about circumstances in his family or in his work that could affect the operation. He had a wife and a son who, by the end of the operation, the son is 18 in 1985. He told us what he needed or what he wanted, and some things we could do and some we couldn't. We in turn gave him cameras as necessary. The spy cameras we would give him would be ones that you exchange the camera, not a roll. In other words, if he had 2 cameras, he could use those, and then we gave him 2 more. He returned those, and we gave him 2 more. We also gave him an operational letter, which would discuss operational things, but also we're trying to be motivational factors, to make sure he understood that he was valued as a human being. And this is very important, going back to an operation which I knew from the 50s, when we were running a GRU officer in the West. We were running him in Vienna at the time. And he said, "You are the first people who have ever treated me as a human being." And he was, a native Russian peasant who had somehow made it into the elite by being a GRU officer. But he always felt that in his own system, he was never treated humanely. And that's one of the things that we do. In our operations, we try always to have that human dimension. It's not a, you do this, we do that. It's a, we're working together in a cooperation for whatever that need is that we've identified you have, or that you've told us you have. So sometimes there were problems. There were changes in the Institute. There were questions that he had about the KGB and their threat, conceivable threat to him. We got to a stage where I took over this operation in January of 1980. So he had been working with us at that stage as an agent for a year. And I was there for 3 years. I was the COS, so it was my men and women who were out there doing the job of meeting with the agent. I never met with him, but I saw him each day in my mind because of the significance of what he was doing. The value we learned at the time when this agent was going on was the Air Force told us that the value of his work to them, the Air Force, was $2 billion. So Hoffman could have called his book The $2 Billion Spy, but he reduced it by half to The $1 Billion Spy. But that's a significant amount of money. And what it was saving the Air Force and the Navy aviation, going down the wrong path in terms of what they anticipated Soviet air defense and air tactics would be. So they didn't need to worry about A, B, and C, but they knew they did have to worry about D, E, and F. So that's where the dollar value comes in for this case. He recognized something about America, which I think is very true, and that is the motivating factor in America is money. It's not apple pie, and it's not mom, and it's not your best friend. It's money. And he recognized money, which he couldn't use. In other words, we could give him large amounts, but what could he do? Because if he tried to use large amounts of money, he'd be captured, he'd be suspect. But he viewed money as a symbol of value, that if we really valued his work, we would pay him well. That's not an unusual phenomenon. I think it's a phenomenon even in our own individual lives. Hey, if you value me, you tell me I'm really doing well, why don't you promote me? So anyway, we did give him substantial amounts of money, which were in an escrow account, which still exists. In other words, an escrow account, once the money is obligated into that escrow account, it can't come back to the agency. The agency holds the escrow account, but it's a real account, but the money is now obligated in the legal financial sense. So he was well paid. He got some amounts of money during his service with us in Moscow, but not a whole lot. And some of the things he wanted, though, were he wanted books, he wanted records for his son. His son was a teenager going through that age when they wanted Western music. And you could get that, everything that he wanted like that, you could get on the black market, but we didn't want him wandering around the so-called black market. So we thought it was safer for us to give it to him so he didn't have to be out trying to scrounge records for his son or Samoizdat, self-published literature on his own. So we supplied that. At one stage, he wanted to read Das Kapital, and we gave him that. I'm not sure why he couldn't have gotten that on his own, but maybe he viewed us as a lending library by this stage. From a couple of times, he reported a crisis in his operation. And at one point he said that because of that crisis, where he thought that he was being investigated, he had destroyed all his materials. He had destroyed his cameras. He had destroyed everything from us. basically a moving meeting schedule. And we resupplied that. Later on, after the case was over, and when David Hoffman was investigating to write his book, Hoffman is a former Washington Post bureau chief in Moscow. He spent about 6 years in Moscow as a correspondent. And so he knew Russian language well, he knew Russia well. And he eventually, although it took a good bit of effort on his part because he was turned down a number of times, he finally was able to interview Tolkachev's son in Moscow. And Tolkachev's son described to him that at a certain stage, his mother had discovered what her husband was doing. And she rebelled against that, not because she was sympathetic to the Soviet Union. Remember, it was her mother and father. Her mother executed, her father imprisoned for 15 or so years. It was because she was scared of what had happened to her family. And she didn't want it to happen now to her new family. And so she insisted that he destroy everything, which he did. But he did not, and that he terminate his relationship with us, which he did not, because he got back in touch with us, misleading us about why he had to get rid of the materials, and continued working with us until his own arrest. So that was the kind of bump that you sometimes get in an agent operation, bigger than a bump. I mean, a sort of a detour. But you don't always know the full story, and that's not unusual. Now, one of the things I say about an agent operation, and this is never talked about in my experience in spy novels or spy movies, is there's really three sides in an agent operation. There's the agent, there's the station, meaning the case officer and the support that we supply, you know, me as COS and communicators and everything. And the third side is headquarters. And headquarters and station may not always agree. And you saw that already at the very beginning when the station, responding to the volunteer, wanted to start it right away, start up with the volunteer right away, and headquarters didn't want to. Well, during the course of the operation, when I was in Moscow as the chief, and Gus, who was my predecessor, was now back as the division chief, think of that as the assistant secretary level in the bureaucracy. Gus was determined to put technical means into our operation. And the technical means in those days, now would be much different, of course. But in those days, it would have been that it would have been a short range agent communication where you can send a message that lasts about a minute and a half, 2 minutes. Or it would be something that might communicate with a satellite, which would be bulky and difficult to use. And I resisted these. And so in Hoffman's book, he discusses that argument that was going on. And you got to understand, Hathaway and I had been friends since 1959. So in other words, we weren't strangers to each other. And we respected each other for our operational skills. But we both had a viewpoint that was, and each of us had a viewpoint that was different. I did not want to put onto the agent the responsibility for these technical things when I did not see how it could advance the case. Because remember, the agent was producing rolls and rolls and rolls of film. He wasn't producing, say, today I heard Brezhnev say the following kind of thing. There was nothing of what he produced that was time sensitive. And also nothing that he produced could be used in electronic transmission. I think Gus wanted to show that we were a with it outfit. And electronic transmissions, we had used electronic transmissions in the Soviet Union before. I was aware of them. I'd used something like that in my previous post, which was Yugoslavia. Believe it or not, all of you today are using the internet, I'm sure, or you wouldn't be here so I can see your faces. Maybe some of you are using something that at least on my system is called Message, where you know, I can type up something and send it right to your phone, and you can respond. You know the system I'm talking about? Instant messenger or something like that. So that was invented really by us back in the early 70s. We didn't call it that, but we created a system whereby you could send something, you can type into a device a message, hit the transmit, we call it send now, and it would arrive in the station. So that's basically the system that instant messenger is. And I knew those systems and I knew we could use them, but I didn't see them as useful in this operation. So, but Gus was insistent, and I think he was trying for other reasons to say Moscow is fully equipped with technical things. Eventually, I agreed to his sending these things for test runs by us in the operational field. And we did. We tested both systems and concluded they couldn't work. The satellite system failed completely. And the so-called short-range system could work, but it worked with such constraints on both sides. And we were testing it, for instance, I would test it with my wife. The constraint on, because obviously we can't test it with the agent, the constraint was that you had to be perfectly still and you had to be able to look down to see that a certain light had come on. These are not things you want to try to do with surveillance, because surveillance is looking at everything you do. And the idea of this electronic was that you could have this engagement with surveillance, but I proved that it wouldn't work in Moscow, so we did not go forward with it. But it was on a number of things like this at headquarters and the field differed. I'll tell you my prejudice. I believe the field is right. And there were times when the headquarters would tell me to do something one way, and I was convinced it was not the correct decision and that it would be better to do the same thing a second way or a different way, and I did. And I did that in all three of my communist countries. And in all three, I was successful. Which does not mean that you're always successful when you take on headquarters, but I established, I think, a record that my judgment was pretty solid because I had spent so much time working in communist countries. And I knew surveillance, I knew operational climate, I knew how to create miracles so that we could be short, we could be out from under Soviet surveillance, because you couldn't meet an agent, obviously, with surveillance. You had to be 100%, not 90, not 95%, not 99%, but 100% confident that you did not have surveillance before you had an agent meeting. And we had lots of agent meetings in Moscow at this time. Tolkachov was only one of the cases we were running. We were running technical operations, and we were running agent operations. And if you read David Hoffman's book, you'll see other of these operations discussed. We were very careful about how we would meet an agent. Sometimes, for instance, if we were under very tight surveillance, I might prepare 3 officers with the requisite cameras, operational notes, other paraphernalia, whatever it is, to go out operationally on the same evening with a 1, 2, 3 priority basis, so that if one had surveillance, maybe case officer number 2 could make the meeting and so forth. So we went to great extent because we did not want the agent sitting out there waiting for us, you know, with all those film camera rolls and so forth. One of the things I learned in life early on was whatever you do, whatever you're planning to do, whatever exercise you have to undertake, you should rehearse it first. Now, obviously, if you're in a play, you know, you do rehearsal. If you're going to make a speech, often you stand in front of a mirror and do the speech. So you can observe how you're doing it. You can observe that you know the materials and so forth. So what I did there in Moscow, I did it in my other, I was station chief in 3 countries and served in 2 others as well, but not station chief. The countries I served in, by the way, just for your background, were in this order: Germany, Bulgaria, Iran, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. And you'll notice that except for Germany, they weren't friendly countries. So I kind of liked that kind of operation. So what I would do with my case officers as they're getting ready for a meeting, they would, of course, have gone through everything, know what's up, know what's important, know what they have to cover. There might be new requirements from headquarters. There might be new operational or communications requirements and so forth. So they had their agenda. And an agenda is a plan. It's not an operational order. It's a plan. Because what I would do then, before each meeting, I would meet with the case officer in my station and do a rehearsal. And I would play the agent in Russian. And he or she would need to deal in Russian with me. Often their Russian was better than mine, so that wasn't a problem for them. And I would see how they were handling the meeting. Because in almost every meeting that I have had with agents, and remember, I go back to the mid-50s, in almost every meeting I've had with agents, something comes up that you did not anticipate. It might be something that's really small, but it might be huge. Like, hey, my wife is divorcing me and she knows what I do. You know, that's kind of a major issue. Well, in going over it, I would see how the case officer was planning his agenda and what he was covering and so forth, and in what order, because you do create a specific order of things, because you might be interrupted. Maybe something occurs that you realize you'd better terminate the meeting fast. you know, and so you don't get to everything in your agenda. So you'd better make sure that the most important things are in the first part of the agenda, not the last. But I would always bring up something that would throw a kilter into the operation, into the agenda. And I want to see how the agent, excuse me, how the case officer handled it. And you didn't have to do it more than once before the case officers knew that they had to handle it correctly, which means depending on what it is, they may shift their agenda to say, okay, let's talk about that. You know, like my wife is divorcing me and she knows that I work with you. Well, that you don't say, well, we'll put that at the last part of, we still have these 3 other things I want to talk about. No, that becomes the number one talk. And sometimes in that rehearsal, I would give the case officer some real last minute instructions. Headquarters might write to us and say the following had occurred or do the following. So I did that. And so rehearsal was always part. And then keep in mind that the case officer is leaving and going off. And he's going to meet the agent at a certain time. So what does he have to do beforehand? He has to do what we call a surveillance detection run. And in a place like Moscow, surveillance detection run would probably be a minimum of 3 hours. Because at some stage in the surveillance detection run, you have to shift from being an American to being a Russian. Because he leaves his home, his apartment, or the office dressed as an American, right? But when he's out on the street, when he's going to approach the agent, he'd better be dressed like a Russian. So you learn the tricks of all that, but you got to grind that into your plan. Once I sent on a very difficult mission, I sent my wife out to do it. My wife was no longer a CIA employee, but she had been for 18 years, and then she had resigned to take up other interests. But what in Moscow, we required that all spouses be cleared, go through the same clearance procedure, including the polygraph. And then we're under a no-fee contract. They weren't paid, but they were under a contract. The contract gave them certain legal benefits vis-a-vis the US government. That was the purpose of that. But I sent Rosalie off on a mission that lasted all day. So sometimes, and it was an American holiday, so there was no reason for her to be, there's no reason that she couldn't be out doing something. What she had to do is make sure she escaped Soviet surveillance. So sometimes it could be very long, but usually in Moscow, it'd be at least 3 hours before you approach the agent. And one philosophy that I had was one agent, one site, one time. Now, what's a site? A site is anything that assists the operation. Could be a meeting site, could be a dead drop site, could be a signal site, could be a technical site, any of those things. So you're always casing for sites. That's something that everybody in the station does every day because you never have enough sites. But the rule that I had was you never use one site more than once. You never use a site more than once. You never use a site that you use with one agent with a different agent. One agent, one site, one time. There's all sorts of good reasons for that, because when you mix up things, you risk causing the loss of an agent if they have gotten onto one thing, and they can now transfer what they've gotten onto to work further with you. Now, I've spoken for about 50 minutes, I think, and you guys are remarkably attentive to me, so thank you for that. But I think it might be useful for me to open up for questions so that you can either gain more information about this case that I may not have covered yet, or you may ask about other things relating to a career that was 39 years in the spy business. So, Chris, I turn over to you how that works.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Gerber. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the questions that I've received in the chat, and then we're going to open it up to questions that you guys have that you can ask yourselves. If you think of anything while we're going over a question, you can just message me, or you can wait so you can ask it yourself. So the first question that I have in the chat is from Denise, and her first one, it's a two-part question. The first part is, did you and his other Tolkachev's case officers like him and get to be what you'd actually call friends with him? Or what was your relationship specifically?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because we're talking about our case officers meeting up with an agent, and who is he or she? And particularly in a case like this, where it's a volunteer, it's not someone that you've been working with for some reason or other, you've become best friends with someone that you are manipulating into the spy business. In this case, the case officers had overwhelming admiration for this man. He was a decent human being. His motivation was strong. His willingness to work with us was strong. He always came up with his own ideas, and he kept bringing up things that sometimes we were uncomfortable with, and I'll mention one in a second. But his sincerity was never doubted, and his general humaneness was never doubted. So the case officers and there were a series of case officers, because whereas he's there every day, we obviously move in and out of the Soviet Union. One issue that he kept bringing up, and he brought it up before I took over in Moscow. He brought it up with my predecessor in his first year of working with us, that he wanted something called an L pill. L stands for lethal. Lethal means he could kill himself with. And he wanted that. He knew that we had such a thing because we had given it at one point to an agent of ours who was arrested, and as he was being arraigned, if you will, the Soviets don't call it that, but as he was being brought in, he bit down on his pen, fountain pen, which had been gimmicked, and the L pill was in that, and he committed suicide. And Tolkachov wanted one for the same reason. He wanted it because if he was captured, he did not want to be subject to torture. The station agreed with that, but the station doesn't make the decision. And it's not the division chief either. The person who makes that decision is the director. And at the time, the division back in Washington and the director said no. Our director at that time was Admiral Stansfield Turner. He was a man who was, first of all, suspicious of espionage. He was more committed to technical intelligence. This is not a secret. I mean, this is well known in the literature. But he's a very decent man and very religious man, and he saw this as a wrong thing to do. When I took over as station chief, Tolkachov was still raising this issue. He raised it politely. He didn't rant and rave or threaten, anything. I mean, he said, "Hey, I want the L pill," or whatever he called it. And we kept saying no. And I realized that this was an interference in our operation. And so I wanted to get it behind us. And so despite my own religious belief that suicide is a sin, I'm Roman Catholic, and so that's part of my belief. I made the decision to recommend again strongly that we do this. And this time the director agreed, and we did give him that means. I say this because once I was asked when I was giving a talk in a university about espionage, if I had ever been asked to do something that was violating my moral code. And since I speak and write and talk about ethics of intelligence, ethics of espionage, this is really important to me. And I said the one time was this, when I felt that we owed it to the agent to put him at ease on something he wanted, even though it was violating what I believe is God's intent. Does that, I think you said Denise asked the question, was it?
Correct.
And does that answer the question, Denise?
It was actually my husband, Tom, but I believe it does.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
Tom and Denise, I'm treating you as a corporation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Tom and Denise LLC. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then the second part of their question is about the film adaptation of John le Carré's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and if you've seen it, and if you could go through a specific scene or in the film in general and talk about what's accurate and what's not.
Well, that's a movie that I said that I saw about a week ago. I don't generally see le Carré movies. I did say when I was serving in Berlin, when the book, his first spy book, he wrote 2 books before that, which are quite good, A Murder of Quality and Call for the Dead, which are more murder mysteries than spy stories. But then he wrote The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. And the media went wild about it. You know, this is a real spy business. And I read the book and I said, hey, here I am in Berlin and I'm doing this stuff. This is not the way it is. And I did see that movie. After that, I pretty much avoided le Carré movies. But as I indicated early in this conversation, I did watch Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy about a week ago, mainly because I was searching for something to watch and it popped up on my streaming service. And I said, okay, I'll watch it. And I did not see any incident in that movie that I considered legitimate. From the beginning until the very end, when they kill their own guy. That's not the way they did that, the way they had that meeting. I mean, think of it, if for those of you who watched it, at one key point, their case officer goes to meet a very sensitive source in Milan. And he meets him at a cafe table in the middle of the cafe, all by themselves in the sense that the table's by themselves and there's other people at tables scattered around. They're the most conspicuous people in the world. If you're in a spy meeting, you're not conspicuous, guys. You're not going to be meeting in a cafe in the middle of a Milan that was like a what do we call it? Like a shopping mall. No, that's not how you do things. And it's that kind of thing that I really resent in le Carré books and le Carré movies. Now, part of the problem is movies. They cannot deal with things without jazzing it up. There's got to have a romance in there somehow. Actually, in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, they avoided that very much. But in most things, they'll insist, even though it's a strictly guy movie, they'll have to put a girl in. So this is one of the reasons why I don't like spy movies. There was a movie called Spy Trainer or something. It was Redford and Pitt, you know, and it was a silly movie in which the Chinese have captured Pitt, who's a case officer in China, and they're threatening to execute him. Now, one thing that you don't do is if you capture an enemy spy, you don't kill him. You interrogate him. You keep him alive so you can keep interrogating him. This is why I'm opposed to capital punishment in general. Michigan, by the way, has never had capital punishment, and I give Michigan credit for that. In my home state of Ohio, we have had capital punishment, and I can't see any difference, in crime rates or anything else. In other words, you're just as likely to get murdered in either state. But anyway, I'm against capital punishment for moral reasons, but I'm against it also. I mean, later on when I went into the business, that if you catch a spy, like Ames or Hansen or somebody like that, don't shoot him, don't electrocute him, hang him, whatever your means is. Keep him or her alive so you can go back and interrogate him again as things develop. So this idea that the Chinese were going to kill Brad Pitt, like in 24 hours unless Robert Redford did something or other was kind of silly. Spy Chief, I think, was the name of the movie. But anyway, throughout movies, I'm very opposed. I'm opposed to the way they do them. Bridge of Spies, if any of you saw that, which deals, among other things, with the trading of Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot, down in 1960, traded in 62 for the man that we thought was named Abel. His real name was William Fisher. We never even knew his real name, although he had been an Soviet illegal in the United States since the early 50s until he was captured in 57. In that movie, because they wanted to use Tom Hanks and make Tom Hanks an innocent, he is the lawyer who is used to negotiate with the East Germans, to negotiate with the East Germans who were acting for the Soviets. And some of you may have some of you seen that movie? You know that episode? And so Tom Hanks is the lawyer. So Tom Hanks is introduced as a lawyer who's grafted into the job. He's really an insurance lawyer in Queens or someplace like that. Doesn't know anything about the spy business, et cetera, et cetera. And he goes off to do this. Well, in reality, the guy who was the lawyer who did this negotiation had been the general counsel for OSS. He was a Fifth Avenue, he was a Park Avenue lawyer, lived on Park Avenue in a multi-million-dollar house. He was a multimillionaire. Yeah, but Hollywood wanted to make him something entirely different. So never look at these movies as having anything to do with reality. And that's how I could not see anything in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy that looked real to me.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Maxine. What was the duration of your career as a spy? If you could give another quick overview. Duration
was 55, 56 to 90, 95. And I retired in February of 95. I had done everything that I could possibly want to do. I had been COS in Moscow, which at that time I thought was probably the best job that any CIA officer could have. And I'd been back then in headquarters running Soviet operations for 8 years from the headquarters angle. And then I went off to do a couple of other things. Gates asked me to set up a requirements post. And then I was a deputy IG for a while, a job that I really didn't like at all. And so when I retired, I was 61 and a half. Some of you are working beyond that. Some of you retire earlier than that, I know. But I retired because I felt that I just needed to do something else. So that was the duration of my career. And so it's almost 40 years. And it was 20 years overseas and 20 years in Washington. I I was reading a document that for my class, my class is every Tuesday night at Georgetown. And for this coming week, it's on covert action. And I was rereading, I always reread everything that I ask the students to read. I try to add new stuff. And this one thing that I read, because it's kind of interesting, was a memo by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was in the Kennedy White House, to Kennedy, to President Kennedy, after 2 months after the Bay of Pigs collapse, that terrible operation. And he's suggesting what should be done about CIA. And he says that CIA, the people who work in CIA are really smart and nice and distinguished and intellectual and really good. But he said the people who represent them overseas are scoundrels. Well, what Schlesinger didn't understand is that it's the same people. it's just where you're getting your mail. So I was sometimes in headquarters and I was sometimes overseas. So, I mean, Schlesinger didn't have a clue. And you may recall that at the time of all that, Bobby Kennedy threatened Schlesinger because he suspected that Schlesinger was going to write a book claiming that Schlesinger was against the Bay of Pigs and how wise he is instead of the people who advised Kennedy to go ahead with it. And Bobby Kennedy, who was not a nice man, very much concerned with the downtrodden of our society, very uninterested in treating individuals decently. He really lit into Schlesinger. But anyway, I can assure you the same people are overseas as are in headquarters. And if we're intellectual in headquarters and decent, I don't think we lose it by going overseas. So the question was about duration. I think I answered it. Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Ellen. And her question is, exactly how does one change from American or Russian clothes en route?
Very good question, because you're sitting there saying, hey, how would I do that? You know, you're picturing yourself in that instance. Well, if you're a guy, consider this. It's very hard to change shoes on the fly. So therefore, you don't wear wingtips, you know, the kind that you get in fancy American stores. In fact, I always wore shoes that I bought in Germany that were kind of plain. You know, so I could wear these normally. In other words, they didn't stand out. They weren't Russian shoes. In fact, it was hard to buy Russian shoes. You had to stand in line for hours. There were always lines in Moscow for anything. And the thing, if we first learned that when we lived in Bulgaria, if you see a line, stand in it. You don't know what it is, but whatever it is, you may need it, or you may be able to trade it for something that you do need. Because the trade economy, it was called on the left, was huge in communist countries because they did so lousily in producing consumer goods. So anyway, you wear shoes that you can continue to wear and would not stand out. You wear dark trousers, because remember, you're going to, which is normal if I'm going to work, right? I mean, I have dark suits. I don't wear a light summer suit. I wear a dark summer suit, you know, if it's summer. And so the pants you don't have to change. Now, what you do have to change are in the headgear, your coat or shirt, if it's in summertime, things like that. And you generally, whenever you're in Moscow, you're American or Russian or Chinese, you're carrying a pack, like a backpack or a duffel bag. Everyone does all the time. And so you've got those things in there. And so at a certain point, as part of your counter surveillance detection run, you might go into a building stairwell. Once you're fairly sure, you may not be 100% sure at this stage, but this is when you're in the 90 category. 90%. You go into a stairwell and you take off your American coat or jacket or shirt, and put on the Russian ones and a Russian hat instead of any kind of American hat. And now you're back on the street looking like the other people. So that's how you do it. And a female like my wife would do it similarly, avoiding American shoes, using German shoes, and dark clothes, nothing stylish. Lord knows anything stylish would stand out in Moscow. I'm talking about Moscow in my day. Nowadays, you got billionaires in Moscow, so it's a different thing. Yes, Chris.
Thank you. This comes from Joseph, and they want to know how a U.S. spy officer has a family in station or at home, or if you have a family at all.
Yeah, we have families. We're normal people. We have kids. We do all the things that normal people do. You know, we get married. We love our wives, or female officers love their husbands. We have kids. We get them educated, and in some posts is schooling, and others they are schooled in. Well, in some places they might be schooled in the way it's more popular here now with homeschooling, but usually going back to the States to some kind of a boarding school. We expect, there are some bachelor officers I know, but most of us, I can tell you, we're married and happily so. The issue that the questioner may be getting at is, how does that affect a marriage when you're in a secret life and you can't talk about it? That is an aspect of things. For instance, in my case, I met my wife in the agency. She was in the agency before I was. She's deceased now. She was a couple of years older than I. She was already in the agency. So we worked together in Germany for 7 years, and then in Bulgaria for 2 years. Then she resigned, having spent 18 years in the agency at that stage, and began another career, but a career that kept her active. For instance, in Tehran, Rosalie was a librarian in an Iranian university, the only foreigner at that university. She had keen insights into Iran that way, because she was working with Iranians every day. She was seeing the demonstrations every day. She was trying to protect students every day. Once she had quit the agency, even when she was still in the agency, we never talked about things that were unique to us, our own operations. We did talk if there were common operations, that she and I were doing something together. But what you do is you don't share with your wife, and I don't know an occupation. In other words, if I'm an insurance salesman, maybe I come home and I tell my wife how the insurance business went that day. If I'm in CIA, I don't come home and tell my wife how the CIA went that day. So there's always a bit of secrecy there. And so the spouse has to understand that, if the spouse is not in the business. The spouse has to understand there's always going to be things that the husband or wife, depending on which one, is doing, that he or she is, the spouse, the unwitting spouse, is not aware of. There were times, for instance, after Rosalie was out of the business, when I was doing some sensitive things, I might call her at the office and say, at her office, and say, I'm leaving tonight on a trip. I'll be back in a month. Didn't tell her where I'm going. Didn't tell her anything about it, because she did not have a need to know it. But she had to have the wisdom and understanding, and because she was a CIA employee herself for many years, she knew what it was, that I wasn't sort of running off to, you know, have fun in Las Vegas. And so there are some strains, if you will, in that regard. But I think that certainly we have wives and children and do things that all other families do, but we always have a secret part of ourselves.
Thank you. This question comes from Alan, and he would like to know, how do double agents work, and is it particularly dangerous?
And is it fairly what?
Is it particularly dangerous?
Oh, for a double agent. Yeah, but you have to be careful about the definition of double agent because the media almost always have it wrong. For instance, sometimes people describe Ames, who was a CIA case officer, who volunteered to the Soviets and became a spy for the Soviets, an agent for the Soviets. They describe him as a double agent, but he wasn't a double agent. He was an agent for the Soviets. A double agent would be, say, if CIA had taken Ames, prepared him with backstopping and with support for him to volunteer to the Soviets, but really be our guy in order to mislead the Soviets. So in other words, he appears to be their agent, but he's really ours. That would make him a double agent. So keep that in mind. That's what a double agent is. It's not a single agent. It's not an Ames. It's not a Tolkachev. It's not. So dangerous, it can be very dangerous. There's a book about a guy named, his real name was Artyomov. He was a Russian Navy officer, Soviet Navy officer, Artyomov. And he defected to the United States in a wild stealing of a boat across the Gulf of Finland with his Polish mistress. And he defected to the United States and took the name Shadrin here. And he became of great interest to the United States Navy. He was a captain in the Soviet Navy, so, you know, he's of interest to the Navy. And he became a paid contractor or consultant to the Navy and advising them on Soviet, everything about the Soviet Navy. At one time, it occurred to some people, I was not involved in this. I mean, I knew it historically, but I mean, I was in the agency, but I wasn't involved in the operation. And there's a book on this. So what I'm quoting from is telling you as a story from a book, not from a classified file. They had him volunteer to the Soviets. Hey, I made a mistake. I wish I hadn't come here. My heart is really in the Soviet Union. And the Soviets began playing with him. And the Soviets, of course, were concerned, how legitimate is he? And they would never meet him in the United States. Excuse me. They would only meet him abroad. But they weren't, they seemed to accept him, but they always had a doubt. And then one day they were smart enough to figure out how to handle that doubt. And knowing something about United States-Canadian relationships, they called for a meeting in Montreal. Now, the agreement between the United States and Canada is that we do not operate in each other's country without notification to that side. In other words, if we were to do something operationally in Canada, we would tell Canada, and vice versa. So we did. We agreed to the meeting in Montreal, and we told the Canadian service about it. Now, what we didn't know was that the deputy chief of the Canadian service was a KGB spy. And the Soviets, of course, knew that they had that spy. And they figured that if Shadrin is a real agent, no one says anything, but instead their KGB spy, deputy chief of the Canadian service, reported, hey, the Americans came in and say they're doing something or other. And so then they knew that Shadrin was a double agent. So they didn't like that. So they had the next meeting in Vienna where they kidnapped him and killed him. So yeah, being a double agent can be dangerous. It also can be safe, depending on, in other words, if we had never let him go to that meeting in Vienna, which I think in retrospect, almost everyone agreed, it wouldn't have happened. Where are you? There. Chris, your picture moves around.
So this question comes from Carol, and she wants to know if you grew up during the Cold War and how that influenced your career.
Yes, I think definitely. I was born in 1933. So when the war ends, it's 1945. So I'm 12 years old. I'm conscious of the world. I'm very much interested in it. Already, I had decided when I was like 10, 11, 12, the war was going on at that stage. And I decided that there's going to be a post-war, and I want to be part of that. In other words, I can't be in the military because we'll have won the war, and we won't have another war for a while. I knew enough history to know that once we win a war, there's not another one for 25 years. That's not true anymore, of course. And so I figured that I want to be in what I discovered was the Foreign Service. So I wanted to be in that. So my life from beginning in high school was very much to plan for the Foreign Service. Now, keep in mind, you're talking about a kid who was never out of the US until he joined the agency, who lived in a small town in Ohio, very unsophisticated. But I had this dream of being out and about in the world. And so I graduated high school in 1951, so the Cold War had already been pretty serious by that time. And I graduated college in 1955, being commissioned as a second lieutenant, because in those days, all males had to take at land-grant colleges had to take ROTC. So I was preparing myself for a career, what I thought would be in the Foreign Service. As it happened, CIA reached out earlier and got me while I was had a first meeting in Morrill Hall, when Morrill Hall was a building which never should have been torn down. It's one of my great regrets about about Michigan State, that they tore down Morrill Hall for building a parking garage in its place, which is obscene in my mind. But anyway, that's where CIA reached out to me. So I ended up going with CIA, but the Cold War was the dominant factor. Yes, World War II, first of all, because that was what awakened me to the world. And then after we defeated the Germans, Italians, and Japanese, then I recognized that, hey, the Soviet Union is a threat. I mean, I didn't recognize it right away, but I mean, but certainly by the time I was a sophomore in high school, I knew that in 1948, when there was the coup in Czechoslovakia, which woke up a lot of Americans. So throughout high school and throughout college, I was motivated by the Cold War and the idea of serving my country, and serving it in a foreign way. In other words, abroad. I didn't want to do something here in the United States. I wanted to be abroad. And at first I thought it was going to be Foreign Service, but it turned out to be CIA, which for me later on, as I look back, CIA was a better fit for me than the Foreign Service.
Thank you. You've talked a lot about it being a male-dominated workplace, but Kelly was wondering if there were any female spies that you've worked with.
Female spies or female case officers?
I would say either.
Okay. Yes, we would recruit female spies if they had access. In other words, the essence of the spying business is to pick out people who have access to information the United States needs. That certainly during my time was more often going to be men than women, but there were some women. I've recruited some women for certain roles, so I know I can do that. In terms of the population in the agency, as I said, my wife preceded me in the agency. They had hired her because she spoke a number of languages natively, Slovak and Polish, plus she had Russian and German. So, I mean, she was hired because she was smart. I was hired because I was available. That's how I always put it. I always say to people, marry up. And by up doesn't mean money, it means intelligence. And I married up definitely because Rosalie was much smarter than I am. And that helped me a lot then, obviously, in my career. But often, and so Rosalie was a professional, but often women were not accepted into the professional ranks. There were some senior women when I joined the agency, and they were people who had also served in OSS. There's been a lot of literature lately about a woman, I'm trying to think of the name. I'm old, so keep in mind that sometimes things jump out of my head. But she was a one-legged OSS officer, and she was a one-legged CIA officer who was in the senior ranks. There were other women like that in the senior ranks, but far fewer. And often what you ran into was something that I don't think I figured it out when I was 22 and began my career, but I certainly figured it out a little after that. And that is, we, in my generation, the generation that graduated college in the mid-50s, we expected women, and women expected themselves to be married and have children. And so often that was the career path everyone expected. I had occasion to attend my class's 50th, which was 2005. And so our class had graduated 50 years before. Remarkably few came back for that meeting. Now, during college days, in those days at Michigan State, there was a senior women's honorary called Mortarboard. It's a national organization, and in those days, it was strictly for females. There was a senior men's honorary in Michigan State called Excalibur, which was only at Michigan State, and which does not exist anymore. And to the extent that men can be honored, they're now part of Mortarboard because Mortarboard is now co-ed. So at this, there was a reception. So I was a member of Excalibur, and I knew a lot of the women who were members of Mortarboard. And these were leaders of the community, leaders of the campus, women of great accomplishment. Because we could, Excalibur and Mortarboard would get together from time to time. There were a couple of one of the guys in Gerber married Jack Matsock married who was captain of the baseball team, married Marge Price, who was mortarboard. But at this reunion, there was a tea at the president's house. And I sat with and chatted with 3 or 4 women that I knew from mortarboard. And we talked about life. We talked about our experiences. And I was devastated in my own private way because all the women had gotten married shortly after college, had children, had loving husbands, had good lives, raised their kids, took part in PTA, took part in community activities, and so forth. None of them sought what we now call a career because it wasn't expected of women, and and women didn't expect it of themselves. So I always felt that we lost the opportunity from about 50% of our population to improve America, or to serve America, or to build America, whatever verb you want to use. Nowadays, women, and I deal with women all the time because half my class in graduate school are women. In the agency today, well, up until this new administration, the director was a marvelous woman who had her first assignment working with me. And she was a DCI under Trump, and 3 of her top officers, I think there's 5, and 3 of those 5 were women. In other words, it's now that women have their proper role in our agency and maybe beginning in other aspects of our society. I realize that every time a woman gets appointed, they talk about a glass barrier and so forth. But I think there's lots of opportunities. But more important, women now expect to have a career and to have children and to have a husband or not. In other words, it's not like you take A or B. You can have A and B both. So at the time when I'm talking about, in Moscow, I did have women, but most were men. And, but I picked out, I mean, when Gina Haspel worked with me, I was a chief and Gina was a beginner. I already saw her as a star. So you have to be there. And so many of women from my age group, and some of you are in that age group or close to it. I may be older than everybody. But you know that women tended not to go out into careers. They had husbands and children, which are important things. I'm not begrudging the family, but you can have both.
Thank you. This question comes from Dottie, and she's curious about the recruitment process for the CIA, specifically if you recruited academics, perhaps because they traveled abroad frequently. Would someone like Dr. Waller make a good agent?
Oh, well, you're talking there about recruitment of employees. And keep in mind, there's different career paths in CIA. Some people are case officers like I was. Some people are analysts. Some people are support personnel, and support in a place like CIA is very interesting because logistics people, for instance, are cooperating in stealing Soviet weapon systems, and getting them transported. It's not ordering pencils and paper. Some of them are science and technology people. So those are different career paths. And academics are represented in each of those, but they're not, but taking my world, which is operations, they wouldn't be an academic and an operator. For instance, a person might have started off in life in academic world and then decided to enter CIA, and that could happen. It wouldn't happen though that he or she would enter CIA while simultaneously remaining an academic, because for one thing, it would be against regulation. We are not allowed to use academics as cover. But it also wouldn't be very, very useful from a standpoint. In other words, being a case officer in recruiting spies, in handling spies, or taking part in covert action or paramilitary operations is a full-time job. But there's certainly academics in the field. There's everybody. The CIA is right now on a big campaign because it feels that it doesn't have enough people from the minorities. Now, in my day, it had very few from minorities for a whole lot of historic reasons. And now it now has some. I mean, I had Blacks and Latinos, Hispanics working with me in senior jobs. But there's still a feeling that the percentages aren't right. I'm not a guy for percentages in that regard. And I think that's a mistake. But the phrase that's being used in government is, and particularly by the Democrats, is we've got to have an organization and a government, a Senate, a House, and everything that looks like America. Well, since America has this many Blacks and this many Hispanics and this many gays and this many people with disabilities, we've got to have the percentages match that. And I don't believe in that at all. I do believe that you have to have women because otherwise you're turning off 50% of the population that can contribute to the defense of America. And for the same reason, I argued at the time that you want to, when CIA would not hire homosexuals, I argued that we shouldn't limit ourselves from people who have something to contribute. And nowadays, of course, homosexuals can be hired in CIA and serve in the military and so forth as anyone else. But for a long time, they were discriminated against. And I said, why do you want to keep people of talent out? The tragedy, if you know the story, do any of you know the story of Alan Turing? Obviously, I would expect Professor Waller, of course, to know because this is British, but at the time of World War II, the great genius was Alan Turing, who was probably the father of the world you live in today, computers. One of his 1930s papers is basically the outline of what the world would come to with computers. And he was involved in the code breaking with of the Enigma, the German Enigma systems. It was in Cambridge Don, went back to Cambridge after the war. He was gay and went back to Cambridge after the war. And he was discovered to be a homosexual. And it was against the law in Great Britain. So they arrested him and convicted him and sentenced him. And he avoided jail by agreeing to take chemicals which would destroy his sex desires, which made him ill. And at the 1912, he was in his 40s, he committed suicide. Think of what Britain could have had if Turing had lived. Think of what Britain and the United States would have lost if they had discovered Turing was gay in the 30s instead of in the 50s. You just don't turn away people. You use people that you can. That's why I think it's important to have opportunities for everyone. But I'm certainly against quotas. In other words, I wouldn't want a system. But right now, CIA is on a big thing to try to reach out. When I was working, we were trying to reach out to historical Black universities and colleges. You've heard of those, that now everyone's talking about them. When I was working, very few people talked about the historical Black colleges and universities. But I and some others, including never just me, a white guy, but with some Blacks, would go to some of these universities to try to stimulate in an audience like this, not online, but in real life, to look for careers in CIA, because many Blacks are distrustful of CIA or distrustful of the government, distrustful of vaccines. That's why one of the problems right now is to encourage Blacks and minorities to get vaccinated, because there's a fear that so many are distrustful of the government. There's lots of reasons if you're Black to be distrustful of the government. So I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I'm saying it has to be overcome. So the agency is on very much continues an effort, and I think that gradually it's going to develop an agency that looks more like America. I can't hear you, Chris.
You're muted, Chris.
Thank you. That's very hopeful future for the agency. There's another question about what happened to Tolkachev. You've mentioned the dangers of being an agent, and you mentioned briefly that he was arrested, but could you elaborate on what happened after his arrest?
Yes, thank you. In 1985, Tolkachev was arrested in June of 85. He was not in a position to use that L pill. He was tried and convicted, and sometime in 86, he was executed. His wife was also arrested on the grounds that she knew about it when she told her husband to destroy everything. And she didn't know that he continued, but she obviously knew that he had been a spy. So they tried her and sentenced her to 3 years. She served 3 years and was released, but she had become ill with cancer during her jail time. And she went to live with her son, who had, in the meantime, the son, by the way, 18-year-old son, had already married and was living with his wife's family at the time of this, when Tolkachev was arrested. Tolkachev never told us that his son had married, which is okay. I'm not complaining about that, but it came as a surprise to us when we learned that. And they had a child right away. And the mother, when she was released, came and lived with her son and his wife, with the wife's family. In Moscow, people moved in together all the time. People didn't live in very spacious apartments unless they were part of the nomenclatura. And she helped take care of the daughter, and then she died early. She died shortly thereafter. So that's a sad story. You might ask, how did it happen? Well, there was a CIA officer named Howard, who I guess if you look at it, if you analyze the operation, or I mean, not the operation, but the personality of Howard, you would determine that he shouldn't have been hired and he shouldn't have been fired. But he had been hired and he shouldn't have been. There were obviously some characteristics that were inappropriate for a case officer. And those characteristics were revealed when he had another series of polygraphs just before he'd been chosen to go to Moscow, where he would be handling sensitive cases. And he was in those polygraphs before the Moscow assignment. These characteristics that should have been discovered before were now discovered, and they fired him. And a year or two later, he made himself available to the Soviets, and he revealed he didn't know Tolkachev's name. He knew enough about the circumstances of the case that they could then identify him. So that's how Tolkachev was caught.
Thank you. This is from Bennett, and he is wondering whether the various countries you served in, were you on a diplomatic passport?
I was in 4 of the 5, not in 1. Yeah.
Thank you. This is from John. He says, greetings, and his question is if you have any thoughts on the current state of U.S.-Russian relations, and if you have any advice that you would give to the Biden administration.
Well, the relationship right now is hindered by the fact that Putin doesn't want to have a good relationship. I think that Biden and his gang have a realistic understanding of Putin, which Obama and Mrs. Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, did not have. Obama and Mrs. Clinton believed that they could reset, remember they used the word incorrectly, they could reset Russian relations, and they couldn't. And basically, I think the 8 years of Obama dealing with Russia were always in a negative way. In other words, we couldn't accomplish anything, but we also didn't stand up to them. I think that President Biden and his gang, Jake Sullivan is the National Security Advisor, recognize what Putin and his gang are, and that they'll be realistic. But one of the things is that you have to be firm when dealing with the Soviets, but you also have to, Russians, but you also have to build on the things that you need. For instance, on climate, on terrorism, on well, those two particularly, on arms control. You need to deal with the Russians, but you need to deal with them from a realistic standpoint. And I'm looking forward to this administration having a better understanding of that than the Obama gang did. Now, the Trump period was also a lost 4 years. We don't know what's in any secret files about Trump in Moscow. And I know that there's all sorts of speculations, about what they have on him. And they may have nothing on him, or they may have a whole lot. But certainly, he never addressed the issue of Russia and Putin in a strong way. And he always seemed, he seemed soft. For instance, he would meet with Putin and announce afterwards that Putin had assured him X, Y, and Z. And he believed him. And he would believe Putin over American intelligence or American diplomacy. That did not make any sense to anyone who's ever dealt with the Soviet Union / Russia. I think the United States has to be aggressive in dealing aggressive with dealing with with Russia, but also look for things where it can cooperate, such as on climate and terrorism, particularly those two, but not to be taken in by Russian promises. Make sure Russia produces. I mean, they too often, going back to the Roosevelt days when we first established diplomatic relations, we've wanted to believe Russia, Soviet Union, and we haven't been realistic enough with them. Truman was my favorite president of my lifetime, of course, is Truman, because he knew what he had to do in dealing with the Russians. I think Eisenhower did too. I think when you get to Johnson and Kennedy and Nixon and so forth, you don't get that strength.
Thank you. And a quick correction, that actually comes from Mike Leahy, who says he's a proud Gerber scholar.
Mike Leahy did earn one of the scholarships that Rosalie and I established in Michigan State. Yeah.
Congratulations, Mike. This comes from Ren, and he wants to know if you ever knew an agent named Miles Copeland Jr. He knows of him because his great aunt taught in Beirut from 1959 to 1964 and got to know him, but apparently he was involved in a coup in Syria in 1949 and Operation Ajax in Iran. Tangentially,
well, Ajax is 53.
Tangentially, how controversial were those types of actions internally?
Yes, I know of Miles Copeland. I never knew that he was Miles Copeland Jr. I just knew that he was Miles Copeland. I did not know him personally. He was involved with Middle Eastern operations, and he was involved in the Operation Ajax, which was a joint US-UK operation to overthrow Mossadegh in 1953. I think Copeland later lived for a long time in Egypt, and he was out of the agency, and he was, I always thought from what I read about him that he was kind of an apologist for the Arab side. That's fair enough if you want to take that position. But he was around in those years, Ren. Now about Operation Ajax, I know that it's gotten a lot more ink lately because a lot of people blame everything about our problems with Iran on the fact that the US and the UK overthrew Mossadegh. And that's simplistic. I have a different view, and you'd say, well, Gerber, of course you'd have a different view because you're one of those CIA guys, and what do you know? But one of the things that annoys me in the press reporting, and keep in mind, reporters, I think a free press is very vital for democracy. I buy and read 3 hard copy newspapers every day. You know, so I'm not I don't get my news from online. I get it from the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. And I'd recommend those 3 papers to you, to everyone. So the media often refer to the fact that the US and UK overthrew a democratically elected prime minister. And that always grates on me because Mossadegh in 1953 was the result of a democratic election. But by that time, he had suspended parliament and he was running Iran himself. I can't call him a dictator because he didn't have that much power, but he was not a democratically elected prime minister. He had suspended the democratically elected Majlis. We got into this because the UK first approached the Americans in '52, and the president was Truman, and the Secretary of State was Dean Acheson. And the Iranians had nationalized British Petroleum. Well, what's now British Petroleum, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which if you now buy BP gasoline, that's whom you're buying it from. Keep that in mind. You're buying it from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company that was behind the coup. I buy BP, but that's because it's the closest gas station to my apartment. Truman and Acheson turned the British down. They said, no, we're not going to cooperate with you on that operation. So they waited, and the next year in '53, the British came back now to President Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles, not Allen Dulles, who headed CIA, but John Foster Dulles, who headed the State Department, and they approved it. And so then CIA was tasked to work with the British service to do the operation. And that's where Miles Copeland comes in as one of those people involved. And the lead guy was the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, Kermit Roosevelt. And so I knew some other people in '53. Keep in mind, I'm up here at East Lansing, so don't hold me responsible. But I did know some guys who worked on that operation. So Mossadegh was overthrown. The Shah, who had fled, the Shah was already the Shah, but he was a weak Shah, and he had fled to Italy, and I'm not sure what that was about. And then he came back and took over. Now, what the media generally don't tell you is that in the '60s, the Shah created something called the White Revolution. And the White Revolution, he chose white as opposed to red because the red was associated with the commies. And the White Revolution was 12 points. And I don't remember all the points, but there were things like full rights for women, the establishment of the equivalent of a Peace Corps in the villages, the scholarships for village youngsters to attend medical school and teacher school and return to their villages as doctors and teachers. Took away, and this is why you have the issue today, took away the land from the mosques. And that's the big deal, guys. It's not like the Ayatollahs are good guys and they're Democrats and they want good things for Iran. They resented the fact that the Shah was not one of them. I mean, not one of them in terms of religion, and that he took away their land. And whom did he give it to? He gave it to the peasants. Who could argue with that? But you'll never read that in the media because it doesn't fit the media narrative, which is the Shah was bad. And it's Americans, it's the CIA's fault that we don't get along with the Ayatollahs. And so I urge you to understand Iran in its totality, not the way the media tell you. You've got to dig into the story of 1953. You got to dig into the story of the White Revolution. You got to dig into the story of the Ayatollahs objecting to the Shah because of what he did with the land. Now, I fully believe by the time I lived in Iran, I'm convinced the Shah was a megalomaniac. I thought he was dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense of he was going to get an atomic bomb and destroy people, but dangerous for himself and for the future of Iran. I moved from Iran to Yugoslavia, and I made a name for myself with the then ambassador, because he asked me on the first day, he said, "What's happening in Iran?" This was 1976. He said, "What's happening in Iran? And tell me what's going to happen." And I said, "Mr. Ambassador," later I learned to call him Larry, but that stage I called him Mr. Ambassador still. "Mr. Ambassador, I can tell you that the Shah's son will never see the throne. I didn't tell him that there'd be an Ayatollah revolt. I didn't tell him there'd be an assassination. I didn't tell him how it would happen. But I said the present system won't last. The Shah's son will not see the throne. So since then, that ambassador has introduced me around town all the time as the guy who predicted what was going to happen in Iran. Not quite true. I didn't predict what would happen. I predicted what would not happen. In other words, that the Shah's days were numbered. I think Iran is the most important country of the Middle East. It's more important than Saudi Arabia. It has a well-educated population, a very cosmopolitan population. They're a long-time culture. They're very proud of being Arabs, and they look down on, they're very proud of being not Arabs. They look down on Arabs, and they call Arabs with words like Southerners used to call Black people in our country. They have absolute contempt for Arabs. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I'm saying you have to understand that about Iran, except for Shiite Arabs. They do see themselves as a defender of Shiism, and there are substantial Shiite populations in Iraq, majority, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Pakistan. And so they see themselves as a defender of that population. That's what's going on in Yemen. President Biden announced that we would no longer support Saudi Arabia militarily in Yemen. And everyone cheered, because we all know that there's tragedies in Yemen. It's just awful. And so everyone's happy. What I wish the president had also said was, and I call on Iran to stop providing military support to the other side in Yemen, the Houthis. The Houthis are Yemeni Shiites, and they're operating at the behest of Iran. But the American press doesn't tell you that. The American press didn't say, Mr. President, what about the Houthis? What instead the American president did is the Houthis had been described by the Trump administration as a terrorist organization, and the Biden administration has taken that designation away. Now, you can argue that, but you have to point out that the Houthis are representing Iran in that fight, and they get their military support from Iran. And the other side was getting it from Saudi Arabia. Well, we're cutting that off. That's fine. But call on Iran to do the same. They never will, of course, but at least recognize, educate the American people that that's what's going on in Yemen, that it's not just one side, that's one side good and one side bad. There's two bad sides in Yemen. I said Iran, I apologize.
Thank you. So the next question is about spying on other countries. And I know that we've basically spent most of the time talking about Russia because the height of your career was in the Soviet Union. But it's clear that the international political landscape is changing, but there seems to be a residual fear in American culture towards Russia. Is it fair that we still be afraid of Russia, or should we be focused on other countries like China?
Well, you can certainly chew gum and walk at the same time, although that's not the phrase that Lyndon Johnson actually used about Ford. You can spy on Russia and China and still collect on other issues. And the main issues, I think, would be North Korea, Iran, terrorism, and proliferation. And I think there's good reason that you want to continue your espionage operation, overall intelligence, not just espionage, against Russia and China. They are not friendly powers. Russia is the one nation in the world that can destroy us. No one else can, but China is approaching that. Probably by 2030, they'll be in the same category as they could destroy us. So you certainly want to know what they're up to. And you want to know what their weapons are. And you want to know what their intentions are. And you want to know their capabilities. So that's what you're trying to do with Russia and China. And with Iran and North Korea, your major concern is about nuclear weapons. In the one case, North Korea is a nuclear power. No US government administration has handled North Korea well because they're now a nuclear power. And Iran is threatening to be one. That would be, and we could say, well, they can never attack us, which is true. They certainly could attack Israel and think about that in terms of American interests. And they also would be a destabilizing, their weapon would be a destabilizing factor in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia would insist on weapons, and Saudi Arabia could buy it from Pakistan. I mean, Saudi Arabia doesn't have to make its own. You would just go with a checkbook to Islamabad. So those are key areas, but there's other areas around the world, and you don't know what's going to happen in a place. 10 years ago, a fruit vendor in a small town in Tunisia complained about being forced to give up his spot. And the policewoman shot him. And a few days later, he died. And that let loose the Arab Spring. In other words, we know that there's instability in places, but we don't know what's going to trigger it. In the Arab world 10 years ago, it was a fruit vendor. We don't know what's going to happen that causes some major turnover in some other place. So you've got to be prepared. You've got to look at the whole world as of interest. That doesn't mean you spy on everybody. You couldn't possibly. You would be surprised how small the American espionage service is. You would be even more astounded to find out how little we spend on espionage. The major stuff in intelligence is spy satellites and SIGINT satellites. That's where the money is. The money is not in the kinds of guys that I recruited. That's why I watched when I first joined the agency, and I was backstopping an overseas operation, and I saw there was an immense quarrel going on between the field and headquarters about a relatively minor increase in pay for an agent. And I said, this makes no sense. All these people who are important people are arguing in cables back and forth about mere numbers of dollars. So I always took the position that you don't argue money. If the field says they need X, you do it. Because the amount of money in espionage is so small. So you can rest assured that you're getting your money's worth when you send me out to do what I had to do. I don't know, Chris, how late. It's now past 7, so I don't know if people have to get to meals or I want to get to a meal. In fact, I'm not a very good cook. Rosalie was a wonderful cook, and I ate so well for 41 years. And Rosalie died in 1999, so it's going on 22 years. 22 years of not eating very well. But
thank you, Mr. Gerber. You definitely gave us plenty of food for thought.
Well,
I appreciate we all appreciate you.
Yeah. Well, think about espionage, think about foreign policy, think about national security, think about all of this. And if I sounded that I criticize this president or that president, I criticize all presidents. You know, so in other words, you could not correctly identify from anything I said which presidents I have voted for in my lifetime.
You're right.
Because I criticize everybody. It's been a great honor to spend some time with y'all. And I had 4 wonderful years at Michigan State. And at that time, studying international relations, I studied under great men named Wes Fischel and Ralph Smuckler and Joe LaPalambara. And those men made me. They taught me critical thinking. They taught me how to work in the world, how to evaluate things. And I owe a lot to those, particularly those 3, but others in the political science department. Just the other day, I read an article, it's in the Michigan State literature, about David Dixon. Do you remember who David Dixon was? He was the first Black faculty member in Michigan State. And he taught in the English department. And when he first came to work there, he was recruited by Hannah because Michigan State didn't have any Black professors. Can you believe it? Michigan, yeah. And he was recruited. He's originally from Maine, and he went to Bowdoin, and he got his PhD, maybe Cornell, something like that. But he was recruited and came there to the English department. And he was a bachelor, so he could live sort of any place. But he eventually got married to a Black woman and had Black children. And he wanted a house, and no one in East Lansing would sell to him because they said it would bring down their values, the house values, not their personal values. Even a professor in his own faculty, in the English faculty, said to him, please don't try to buy a house in East Lansing because it's going to affect our values. My God. Hi, Mike, I see you there now. So Hannah put pressure on the city of East Lansing, and David Dixon was able to buy a house. David Dixon was one of the most popular professors at Michigan State. I loved his course. The course I took from him was the English Bible. And I knew the Bible. Yeah, of course. I mean, the way any kid who was sort of went to Catholic Sunday school knew the Bible. But I really learned the Bible from David Dixon. And he was a great man. But think of that. Michigan State didn't have a Black professor until the 40s and wouldn't allow him to buy a house until the 50s.
Well, thank you, Professor Gerber, for joining us. I know we stayed long after the scheduled time, but I think that speaks to the wealth of information you had to share with us. So on behalf of the Social Science Scholars Program,
well, goodbye to you all. It was a great pleasure. As I said, I started saying how much I enjoyed Michigan State. So I enjoyed seeing you all here today. And stay healthy and stay safe.
Thank you so much, Burton.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Really wonderful.
Great to see you, Burton.